For topic 2, we're going to move on to the Greek aorist indicative, Koiné Greek. So we will be looking at aorist indicative verbs. We will review the rules for forming first and second aorist tense verbs, and then we'll work through some example sentences taken from the New Testament. So we looked at the imperfect in topic 1, and now we're going to look at aorist. We notice that for both of them, they are secondary tenses, so they focus on the right column of that table we looked at. We'll bring it up again soon. Both imperfect and aorist have an augment, typically an epsilon, and they use secondary endings. Now, the second aorist has a number of properties. First, it has an augment like all of the secondary tenses, but the stem is different from the present and imperfect tense stems. So we noted last time that the present and the imperfect will have the same stem. For second aorists, the stem is different. The second aorist has the same connecting vowels as the imperfect, and it has secondary endings, the same active and middle passive endings as the imperfect. So essentially, aside from the stem change, second aorist forms are identical to the imperfect tense. So let's look at some examples. We have the verb ballo. Notice the double L, the double lambda, whereas the second aorist form has only one lambda, ebalon. And so this is a typical first singular or third plural ending we saw for the imperfect, but notice that the stem has changed. This tells us it's second aorist. Similarly for lambano, notice that in the aorist, the mu drops out, and so we have elaban. So the stem has changed. Other than that, it looks a lot like an imperfect with the augment and the ending, but the stem is different. Similarly for ginomai, note that the stem is changed to gen instead of gin. For erkomai, we have a more radical change. It goes to aelf. And so the stem changes, and so we do see that it's second aorist. Finally, for gnosko, the stem changes to gno, so gamma, nu, omega. And in that case, we have egnon. And the form here is the stem is bumping up against the omicron connecting vowel and the ending nu, and then the omicron and the omega contract and just become omega, so we get egnon. So these are examples of where the stem changes, but otherwise the ending looks a lot like what we expect for the imperfect. So here for ginomai, we have a middle passive form in the present tense, and just like with the imperfect, we have a middle passive ending here, amen. So, egenamen becomes our second aorist form. So again, it looks a lot like an imperfect, except that the stem has changed. So let's take a look at our chart here. The second aorist will be over here on the right side. And here is an example, elaban, elabes, elaben, elabamin, elabete, elaban. Notice the endings on, s, n, amen, eta, on are the same as we saw for the imperfect. Similarly for the middle passive. So we have amen, u, ata, amata, esta, anta. Those are the same as we saw for imperfects. So the connecting vowels are the same, the endings are the same. So the second aorist, except for the change of stem, looks the same as the imperfect. So for first aorist, we have an augment just as we do for the other secondary tenses. We normally use the same stem as the present tense. There is a tense formative. It is sigma alpha, sa, except for the third singular, which is sigma epsilon, se. We'll see why in a minute. There are no connecting vowels, and there are secondary active and secondary middle endings, but note that the middle and passive are not the same. So for the present tense and the imperfect tense, we just call them middle passive because they're the same. But remember, for the future tense, we only looked at active and middle. We didn't look at passive because passive is different. We'll actually be looking at that later in this class. So for the first aorist, the secondary active and secondary middle endings are distinct, and then there's also a distinct set of passive endings for the aorist. So keep in mind that the middle is not the same as the passive. Here's an example now. We have elusamen, which would come together as elusamen, and that would be your first plural form. The men ending is first plural. So let's take a look at the full chart here and see what this all looks like. So now we're looking at the right-hand side of the chart. We have first aorist now, and notice that we have secondary endings except for the first singular. Instead of being a new, it's blank, there's no ending. And the third singular, instead of sa, we are going to have sa. So other than that, the secondary endings will be the same. Same down for the plurals in the actives, and then the same for all of the middles, main, sa, ta, mathas, tha, and ta. So just those two exceptions. The first singular form has changed to a null ending. The third singular form, the tense formative, has an epsilon. It should be clear if we think about it why we need an epsilon here, because if this was an alpha, we would have san or sa. It's a movable nu, so the sa would make us equal to first singular, and the san would make us equal to third plural. So it becomes sen, elusen. Notice that for the imperfects, the first singular and the third plural were the same, that omicron nu ending, on. In this case, for the first aorist, the first singular is not the same as the third plural. So elusa, elusas, elusen, elusamen, elusata, elusan. And then down at the bottom we have elusamen, eluso, elusata, elusamatha, elusastha, and elusanta. So those are our first aorist forms. Let's look at some examples of aorist tense. So we have ebale, ebale. And this is the aorist active indicative third singular of balo. Notice the stem changes, so it is a second aorist, and the ending then is what we would expect for an imperfect. It's a third singular, is that epsilon iota ending. Here we have agenita. That's actually a very common word in the New Testament. Agenita, and it is aorist middle indicative. It's that eta ending, amen u eta, third singular from ginomai. Again, the stem has changed. So we have from gin to gen, and so it's second aorist. Going back to the meaning of this first one, ebale would just be he, she, it, through. It's more of a whole picture view of the action. So he, she, it, through. Here we have egenita, he, she, it became. Now here we have akusata, akusata. Now akuo doesn't change the stem. So notice that we have the sigma alpha tense formative in here. So we have the normal augment, the alpha has changed to a eta, but we have now the tense formative sigma alpha, and then the ending, and we have te, which is our active second plural ending. And so we have aorist active indicative second person plural of akuo. Here's another example. We have egropsen, and here the phi from grapho, bumps up against the sigma in the tense formative, and it turns into a psi. We studied that in the chapter on futures when we discussed the square of stops. So beta, p, phi, when they bump up against the sigma, they become a psi. So we get egropsen. So the sigma is inside that psi in a way. It's pronounced in there. And then we have the ending that we would expect. Another example is apokrinanta. Apokrinanta. This comes from apokrinamai. Now notice what's happening here. We have the sa tense formative bumping up against a liquid stem ending. So apokrin, and we studied liquid stems back when we looked at future tense as well. And so here the sigma drops out and we just get na. So we get apokrinanta. So we do see the augment here in the epsilon from apa to ape, but we've lost a little bit of our information. We've lost the sigma that is helpful in telling us that we're looking at an aorist, a first aorist. So we have to look at this and say, well, I see the alpha and I see that ending, which looks like a secondary ending, but note that the stem has not changed. Apart from the augment, the stem is apokrin. So the secondary ending is pointing us to first aorist rather than second aorist, where the stem would have changed. So putting all that together, I'm going to say this is a first aorist, and that the sigma dropped out because of this liquid consonant. Apokrinomai means to answer, so this would be third plural, they answered. They answered. We should note that the meaning of the first and second aorist is the same. So the form is different, but the meaning is identical. So what is the meaning of the aorist tense? Well, aorist tense has perfective aspect, as we said last time. I noted that some grammars call this undefined or aoristic aspect, but in Mounce's grammar, he calls it perfective aspect, and we'll just stick with that. What that means is we're looking at the action from outside. So what does that mean exactly? Well, we can say that the action is viewed as a whole, but we need to be careful not to overgeneralize. The aorist is a very flexible tense. It can be differentiated from the imperfect in that the imperfect tends to be more continuous or repetitive, something like that. But some people try to argue that the aorist is only once for all action. Well, it can mean once for all, but that's not all that it can mean. Context will tell you what's going on with it. So for instance, it can emphasize the whole action. So Romans 5:6b, Christ died for the ungodly. Pretty much talking about that action as a whole. And here's a case where we could talk about once for all action. Fair enough. In this context, we're looking at the whole action, and he died once for all. But the aorist can also emphasize the beginning of an action. So Matthew 9:27, two blind men followed him. Well, that's an aorist, but the idea is that they began to follow him. And then finally, it can emphasize the end of an action. So let's take a look at John 1:42, where it says, he brought him to Jesus. The idea is that after he brought him to Jesus, the action was ended. And these are a few general ways of looking at it, and it's more nuanced than that. And you'll want to look at a syntax, a Greek syntax, to learn more about the wide uses of the aorist. Let's work through some examples that are in the workbook. And this is chapters 22 and 23. And here's the bibliographical information for the workbook. It's the 4th edition and published by Zondervan. So the first example comes from Mark 14:16. So let's read that. Kai exeilthon, hoi mathetai, kai eilthon, astein palin, kai euron, kathos apen autois, kai etoimasan, tapaska. All right, so we have a couple of second aorists and a first aorist in here. So we have kai exeilthon. So I think we noted that for erkomai, the second aorist stem for that is going to be elf. Elf, very strange, but it is what it is. And so we have ex erkomai, and then that just becomes ex elphon. So second aorist, the beginning stays the same, and then the stem changes the same way that it does for erkomai. So ex eilthon, and that means to go out. So, and they went out. So this is an on, and it could be either first singular or third plural, but notice the subject here is hoi mathetai, the disciples. So the disciples went out, kai eilthon. And so now we have eilthon by itself, interestingly. So here we have ex eilthon, now we just have eilthon. So they went out and they went or they came. So this is very similar. It's going to be a first singular or third plural, but we can pretty well tell it's third plural because it's still the disciples we're talking about. So they went out and they came, astein palin, so they came to the city. Now here's another second aorist. This comes from the stem eurisko, and the stem changes. It drops that isk, iota sigma kappa, and so we're looking at a second aorist. It's got the secondary active endings that look like imperfects. So we have euron, and they found, eurisko means to find, and they found, again, it's going to be third plural, not first singular. And they found as, kathos, a pen. So here we have another case. This is Lego, and the stem changes. Stem changes to ape. Again, we have this again, it's going to be third singular this time because this is what Jesus said. So as he said, and then autois, to them. Nice dative personal pronoun there. So he said to them, and this is the end. This is the end of what you see in your workbook, but I added the rest of the verse because we have a nice first aorist verb in here. Kai etoimasan tapaska. Etoimasan is going to be first aorist, and this comes from the root etoimazo, means to prepare. And so we have an augmented first letter here. The epsilon augments to an eta. And then we have the asan. So we have etoima, and then we have the sa, tense formative, and then we have the new ending. This is going to be an aorist active indicative, and it comes from etoimazo, and it's third plural, that new ending. So san is your third plural ending. So etoimasan, and tapaska, the Passover. And the disciples went out, and they came to the city, and they found as he said to them, Jesus said to them, and they prepared the Passover. Okay, let's move on to Mark 135b, and then 136, and then 137. The workbook doesn't have verse 136 in it, but I added it because we have a nice first aorist verb in there. So let's read this. Exalthen, we saw the same verb earlier, only this is a singular rather than a plural. Exalthen kai apelthen eis erimon topon. Kake prosaukata. An interesting diphthong there. So let's take a look at this verse. We have the same verb that we had in that previous verse, exalthen, and here we have the epsilon new ending. So this is going to be third singular. So it's a nice second aorist verb, but it was third plural in that previous one. This is going to be third singular. And again, it's aorist active indicative, third singular. Kai, and then apelthen. So this is apa plus aelthen. And again, it's second aorist and a third singular. So likely exalthen means he went out, probably from the house. This is referring to Jesus. And then apelthen went away, eis erimon topon, to a deserted place. So we've got these two nice third singular aorist verbs. He went out and he went away to a deserted place. Kake, which is a put together kai eke, just means and there. Prosaukata. This is the verb proseukamai, to pray. So proseukamai, interestingly, there is an augment. You see the epsilon turns into an eta, but you don't see much of a stem change here, and yet this is a second aorist ending. So I'm not clear what the stem change is here, but it is using a second aorist ending. So it's a third singular verb, he, she, it, but it's referring to Jesus, so he prayed. So he went to a deserted place, kake, and there he prayed. Now we come to Mark 136. Let's go ahead and read that. Kai kata dioxen autan simon kai hoi met autu. So this verb here, kata dioxen, this comes from kata dioko, which we probably haven't had yet. Dioko means to persecute or pursue. Kata dioko means to pursue or follow. This is a nice example of a first aorist. So we see the kappa of the stem coming up against the sigma epsilon of the aorist tense formative. And that's giving us a xi, and then the ending, the epsilon nu. So we have a third singular, and it's a aorist active indicative. and it is from the root katadioko. So it says, he followed him. Now we look for a subject and we see Simon. So it looks like we have a singular verb applying to Simon, but we also have kai hoi met autu, which is the ones with him that comes after. So we have a singular verb applying to Peter and others. This happens sometimes in Greek where a singular verb is used for a singular subject that also has other subjects after it. In this case, the other subjects are kai hoi met auto. And so hoi is a nominative plural article being used kind of like a pronoun here. And so we have the ones with him. That's nominative. Simon is nominative as well. So Simon and the ones with him followed him, meaning followed Jesus. Okay, so there's a nice first aorist verb with that sigma tense formative, sigma epsilon tense formative. And then we come to Mark 137. Kai euron auton, kai legusin auto, hati pantas zetusin se. So our aorist verb here is euron, and this comes from eurisko. And so that sigma kappa is getting, actually that iota sigma kappa is being lost, and so the stem is changing. So this is a second aorist, and the on ending tells us this is third plural or first singular, but based on the context, since it's Simon and those with him, we can get rid of first singular, so it's going to be third plural of eurisko, and they found him. There's our accusative direct object. They found him, and they say to him, notice this present tense, that's very interesting. It's a present tense form here. We haven't talked about this. It's called a historical present, and it refers to a present tense verb that's being used like an aorist. And Mark and John uses them a fair amount. Mark uses them a fair amount as well. So we have an aorist over here. The meaning is past tense, and it's used mainly in narrative. And so, and they said, auto, to him, indirect object here. Hati, and hati here, we could say that, but it's kind of like quotation marks. So hati here is kind of like putting quotation marks in, and then what follows is what they said. And they said to him that Pontes zetusensa. Pontes is third declension, and the epsilon sigma ending tells us that it is nominative masculine plural, and it means all. So all masculine plural is the subject. So all men or everyone, zetusen, is looking or seeking. Everyone is seeking you. So present tense, no augment. So nice present tense verb. Everyone is seeking you. Everyone is looking for you. So that's what Peter said. Now let's go to, this is going to be number 10 in the chapter 23 of the workbook. So I've switched over to chapter 23 so we can get some first aorist forms. Matthew 7:22, I'll go ahead and read it. Pauloi erusin moi en ekene te hemera, kurie, utoso anamati eprophetusamen, kai toso anamati daimania exebalamen, kai toso anamati dunames palas epoesamen. The question mark, the semicolon looking thing is a question mark. So this is people questioning Jesus on that day, why he is telling them to depart from him. All right, so paloi, many, this is a nominative masculine plural ending. erusin. And the note I have here is that this is a pattern 2 future root of Lego, and probably briefly talked about those when we looked at futures, but you might not remember it by now. So this is a future, this is a pattern 2, meaning that the root is different for the present tense form and the future tense form. So many will say to me, moi, so a dative of ego, meaning just to me, en ekene te hemera. So this is a demonstrative pronoun ekene, in that the day, or in that day. So many will say to me in that day, Kyrie, Kyrie, Lord, Lord. This is two vocatives, Kyrie, Kyrie. Not, so this is a not, we'll put it together, not to so anamati. So these are datives, literally to the name to you, and we would say this is to your name or in your name. Remember, the dative can be in by with to, so this would be in your name. So not in your name, eprophetusamen. Might not have seen this verb yet, but it's prophetuo. Prophetuo, and it means prophesy, to prophesy. Notice we have the augment, and then we have a nice first aorist looking ending here, samen. Is going to be a first common plural aorist active indicative of prophetuo. And so he's saying, not in your name did we prophesy? So did we not in your name prophesy? Kaito so anamati, so and in your name. Daimonia, so this is an accusative. So daimonia, and then we have an aorist verb here, exibalamen. This is a nice second aorist verb, balo. So the stem changes, and it's actually ekbalo. And when we put a vowel in between, the kappa will often change to a xi. And that is pretty standard rule. It's talked about back in Mount's chapter 21 as he talks about compound verbs when we put a preposition in front of a primary verb. So ex ebalamen, so this is another first common plural, aorist active indicative. And in your name, cast out demons. Kai to so anamati, and in your name, dunames, so mighty works or wonders. Palas, many, and then we have a nice first aorist verb here, epoiesamen. It's going to be poieo, and get the same samen ending, so the sigma alpha tense formative, the men ending. So first common plural, aorist active indicative. And so let's read through this now. Many will say, paloi erus, and many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, not in your name did we prophesy, or did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name cast out demons, and in your name many mighty works do, or perform, I guess you'd maybe say in English. And then Jesus says, depart from me, I never knew you, you workers of iniquity. So they thought they were doing a lot of good stuff, but it turns out that they were not doing the will of the Father in heaven, as Jesus said in Matthew 7:21. Okay, so some examples of first and second aorist from the New Testament.